Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have a returning guest. He never seems to run out of things to say, very interesting things. So I have Ken McCarthy. Ken has been involved in internet marketing for as long as there has been internet marketing and before there's been internet marketing. He runs what's called the System Club that has just, again, an endless, stream of audio content and written content and things that he's produced over the years. He's interviewed many of the top people in internet marketing and in marketing in general. And he's been writing a whole series of books lately, and one in particular that I picked up I think is great. It's called How the Web Won, the inside story of how a motley crew of outsiders hijacked the information superhighway and struck a blow for human freedom. And there's a couple of reasons why I think this is great. One is that when you have someone that has been around for so long and has done so many great things in marketing, a sphere that I really am interested in, you want to learn about them, and sometimes you can't always sit and talk to them. So he has written a book that talks about his history and how that intersected with the creation of, the World Wide Web, and how his hand played a role in it and the characters that were involved in it. From what I've read so far, I'm about halfway through the book. It's really interesting. Great book. So I want to welcome you back, Ken. Thank you for being here.
Well, Rich, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, tell me, how did the idea for this book come to you?
Well, as you know, I've been teaching, in addition to the other stuff I do, I've been teaching internet marketing, since 1993. It's kind of a long time, And when I was into it, I was just teaching it. I wasn't telling people about my specific background because that wasn't necessarily what they were there for. And then the other thing, I was explaining this to somebody just today. I said, my story is a little more involved than I can tell, at a cocktail party or even in a podcast, And so I had to write a book about it. And I had originally thought I'd given a lot of speeches and written a lot of articles, especially in 1994. And they were pretty important articles for the time and talks. And a lot of them really hold up all these years later. It's now 30 years later. And I thought, well, I'll just collect them. I'll write a little introduction and, I'll have another book to put on the shelf. And then by weird coincidence, we decided to put some kind of air conditioning thing in our house that required all this machinery being put up in our attic. And the guy said, I can do it, but you got to clean up your attic, right? So it's like, oh my God, this is 25 years here and then another 25 years of accumulated stuff, business records, files, all this stuff, right? So we're throwing a lot of it out. And every now and then I'd come across something literally amazing. Like, marketers will appreciate this. I mean, I have correspondence, letters back and forth between me and David Ogilvy, me and Eugene Schwartz. Everyone will know the name Arthur C. Clarke. He's not a marketer, but he's the guy that wrote 2001. And so that made me realize, gosh, I thought I lost everything, basically, right? Because I'm not an archivist, right? What I realized what I was doing over all these years was taking stuff and putting them in banker's boxes, right? And no filing system. As soon as the banker's box was full, I'd put it up in the attic. And so there were in excess of 30 banker's boxes up there. And I guess I had time on my hands and I went through them all. And I ended up with a box full of kind of truly amazing archival stuff, not just archival importance to me, but of archival importance to any historian that wants to understand the critical years of the World Wide Web, which were 1993 to 1995. So I said, well, instead of writing one chapter, as an intro, I'll write two, And next thing I knew, I wrote a 75,000 word book. And the more I wrote, the more I realized how amazing that time was, because I'll tell you this, when 1993 dawned, right? January 1st, 1993. No one had heard of the World Wide Web. No one. Like maybe a few thousand computer engineers who were heavily into telecom stuff.
Well, what would it have been called at that time? Because I was on the web, on the whatever you call it from 89, but what would
Well,
you call back then?
that's one of the things I explain in the book. And there's a lot of, it's funny, after I've written the book, I realize a lot of people have this basic confusion. So the internet, which is the fundamental kind of like roadway, all the machines, all the telecom connections, all the software, that's been around in some form or another since 1969. Okay. Computer bulletin, and it was very rare. I mean, it was like, it connected Stanford and Berkeley. I mean, it was, it wasn't a very big network in 1969. And then you had PCs, which didn't come along till the 70s. And then modems came along. And then people started creating computer bulletin boards, which is probably how you got on. And if it was late 80s, yeah.
Yeah, I would dial in to the modem. Those sounds.
All that weird
and
yeah.
And it would be text. And they had a rate called baud, BAUD. Right. So it was 300 baud. So the text would go onto the screen. You could read it. And when it got to be 1200 baud, it was really fast. But yeah, I would go on bulletin boards, and I even played a text game called British Legends, but it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
So that's what the web was. Yeah.
That was not the web. And that was not even the internet. That was a probably privately owned computer bulletin board service. And the people didn't get connected to the internet until CompuServe, which was sort of the big gorilla of online services before AOL. CompuServe gave everybody an internet email address. That was in 89, I believe. Yeah. And that was that was the first time that civilians were on the internet. And they weren't really on the internet. They were able to send and receive internet email. They didn't have access to the internet at all other than the email system. So that was 89. Everybody else was either an academic or a military guy or a defense contractor. And they had connection to the internet, which, by the way, you weren't allowed to play games or sell things or publish things on the internet. That was for government use only. In fact, commercial activity of any kind was strictly banned, and that was strictly enforced. But you had these computer bulletin boards, and the way they work, as you recall, you dial in, on your modem, and you would connect to a single computer. Now, remember, the internet is millions and millions and millions and millions of computers all connected together. That's the internet today. But pre-internet, you would dial in and you'd be on one computer and one computer only. That was your entire online experience. And if you wanted to send email or a message to somebody who was on another computer bulletin board, you couldn't.
Crazy.
Right. So the whole universe.
I remember seeing the first website until probably at least 94, I think.
Well, there were no until 93, there were no webs. I mean, there were like a couple of hundred websites in let's say probably 91, 92. You didn't get anything graphical on the web until 93, and it was very primitive. And the public didn't really start seeing it until 94. The very earliest, civilian public folks would have started to see the web in its primitive form and graphical form in 1994. But there were no graphics on the web until 1993. And I want to stress this, January 1st, 1993, nobody was on the web. Now, the web is something that lives on top of the internet, right? So the internet's like the roadway, and the web is like the suburban development with all kinds of houses built on top of it. So everybody talks about, hey, I'm on the internet, or I saw it on the internet, and that's strictly speaking true. But what we deal with, if we're dealing with Amazon, if we're dealing with Facebook, if we're dealing with crypto, if we're dealing with ChatGPT, hey, if we're listening to this podcast, we're dealing with the web layer, the web. Right. And that fellow didn't get developed until 89. That code didn't even exist until 89. It didn't get launched until 90. It was in a bit of a hibernation period for a while where, a few hundred people literally globally were on it. And then some kids basically at the University of Illinois created a graphical interface point and click for the web, which was called Mosaic. And that they did that in 1993. And that's what got the pot boiling. But until 1993, and 1993 was still sort of proto-history, right? It's early history. You didn't see the public even thinking or talking about the web until 94. So the book covers the years 93, which is, again, I want to stress, January 1st, 1993, no for all practical purposes, no living human being had ever heard of the World Wide Web. And then by the middle of 1995, the web was such a huge deal that it was one of the most spectacular, basis of one of the most spectacular IPOs, initial public offerings in the history of Wall Street. That was Netscape. And then once that happened, then the Wall Street paid attention, the news media paid attention, billions and billions of dollars flowed into it. All kinds of websites were going up. They were buying ads on the Super Bowl. That all happened 95, post 95. But you have to, I want to say this again. I know I'm kind of a broken record. Nobody had ever heard of the web January 1st, 1993. And by the middle of 1995, it was probably the biggest topic of the news. And obviously, we're all living on the web today. So strangely enough, the historians and the journalists and the scholars and all these people, I couldn't find a single book that really explained how it went from nobody knowing what it was to it being the most important thing on earth in 2.5 years. And so I happened to live through it. I was actually involved in more than a few important initiatives that made all this happen. And, I've read Wired magazine, which I think is a steaming pile of crap, but they did a terrible job of telling the story as it was happening, and they haven't done a much better job afterwards. And of course, the other news media, completely useless. And scholars, I guess it's not old enough for scholars really to be studying it. So I realized, boy, if I don't write this down, nobody's going to know what really happened and how it went down. And again, it's slightly longer story than one can tell at a cocktail party, but I can definitely give the fireworks part, during a podcast.
Yeah, I remember it was just the domain of nerds. I graduated high school, June of 93. And then I remember going to college, and I went to a nerdy college in engineering. And they talked about Mosaic browser, and you had to do all this rigmarole just to connect to it. And there was not much to connect to. It was just so primitive. And I remember back in the day, I met a girl online. So actually it was probably the first people to do online dating. I met her and, in a forum, spoke to her, and I visited her. But, I like to tell people that back then, if you met someone on the internet, you were a loser. Why couldn't you meet someone in real life? And now it's the predominant way to meet people. So it's just amazing how things have changed so much.
Yeah, that was pretty avant-garde stuff you were doing back then, meeting strangers on the internet. Yeah, I mean, it was very difficult to get the browser, download it, configure it, and then once you download it and configured it, where were you going to go? Somewhere in the book, and it's funny, you write a book and you forget the details, but I think as late as 1993, there were only about 500 websites on the planet total. So, there wasn't a lot of motive. So only people that were, really into doing geeky things were messing with it at all. And it's a chicken and egg, right? Why would anybody go through the hassle of getting a web account if there's nothing on the web? And then the other side of the equation is, why would anybody put anything on the web if there were no people using it, right? So somehow that logjam had to be broken. And it got broken in 1994. Which was sort of the key year. So 93 was like the prelude, the rumblings. 1995 was the explosion, suddenly it's on everybody's lips. 1994 is when all the stuff that mattered happened.
What was, I was going to just say something brief about the graphics. So what was considered graphics was, I remember playing a game called Telengard. This is just on the computer, but also on the web. You'd have, let's say, asterisk, make a wall of the game, or slashes would make, a door. That's how graphics were on the web or the internet when I first was on it, before there was any real graphics.
Yeah, it wasn't graphics. It was manipulating text, right, into things that looked graphic.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if there's a word for it, but that's what I remember seeing.
It's funny that's like a whole primitive art form that has disappeared in the mists of time. But there were a lot of people that were quite good at drawing things just with periods and hyphens and parens and so on. Yeah. And the web didn't get the ability to host images or to download or present images until 1993. So it was invented in 1989. It made it to the United States via Stanford in 1990, and it had no graphics. It was young people, anybody born after, I guess, 1990, can't even imagine a world where your computer, odds are, was just black and white text, no pictures at all. Right?
Yeah, I remember sitting in front of a computer in 87, and I thought, what do you do with this thing? I know it sounds stupid, but I was like, you just had cyan screens, and you could do like dir / something, to go into a directory or, copy a file. But I was like, what do you do with this?
Yeah. And yet by 1993, there were somewhere between, no one really counted accurately, but somewhere between 2 and 5 million people were using bulletin board services. Like a lot of them were using CompuServe. There was something called Prodigy. There was something called Genie. AOL was fledgling in 93. It's big breakout. They went from 1 million to 20 million users in 1 year. And that happened in 94. So that got a lot of people online. But all that stuff were bulletin board services. You were logging on, and this is really an important concept. You were logging on to the AOL system. You were not logging on to some global web where you could reach, websites in Singapore and, Argentina and all that. No. What you could only, it's like you were going into a restaurant and you could only eat what was in the restaurant. Like if you were in a sushi restaurant, let's say, and you wanted, Cajun food, you weren't getting Cajun food, right? You were getting only what was on the bulletin board itself. It was as if you had to log on, as if the online experience was you dial up by phone, and then you would be on a single website. I mean, it wasn't a website, it was a bulletin board service, but we'll call it a website for point of comparison. And that was it. You couldn't go to any other website. And if you wanted to get to a different website, you had to log off online, redial up your modem, and go to another website, right? Now, if the website happened to be in China, or if the BBS happened to be in China, you had to pay long distance charges to connect to that BBS.
I remember, yeah.
Yeah,
it was like 25 cents a minute, and then it went down to 10 cents a minute with MCI, but it was still expensive.
Oh, yeah. I mean, again, this is something that you can't appreciate unless you're of a certain age. Long distance used to be super expensive. You could easily run up $100 on a single call if you were calling, way out of your, long distance. That's what the world was like. And to make it even worse, not only were you paying when you were logging onto a commercial bulletin board service, a big one like CompuServe or even AOL, you were also paying by the minute to be on that service. So you were paying your phone charges, plus they were metering you by how long you were on their service. That didn't change until I think 96. But the most important thing about this is to understand that people did not have access to the internet. They were accessing individual computer bulletin board services. It was an online experience, but it wasn't the web. And the people that were on the internet, again, it was illegal to sell internet access until 1989. You couldn't sell it. It was you couldn't do anything commercial with it. It was only for universities, for the Pentagon. In fact, I don't think we got a .com domain name until the late 80s. Everything was .mil, military, .edu, .education.
Yeah, .gov. And that
was the other one. So,
the history of like ICANN or Whois, or there's certain like artifacts on the web that have been there for a very long time. I don't know where they came from or who said, all right, we're in charge of this or that.
I'm trying to remember how the domain name system went through a lot of interesting permutations. It used to be, if you wanted a domain name, you had to write in with a bunch of them because there was no way. Can you imagine this? This was into the 90s. You couldn't just go online and see if a domain name was available. You had to send it to a clerk, and you would send him or her, your top 5 choices. And if the top one was available, good. If not, they'd give you the second one or the third one or the fourth one. And then they write you back and say, oh, this is available. Pay us $100, right? And then something called Network Solutions was given the contract to handle it. And then they opened it up, and now you have 1,000,001 domain name registrar. So that's the shape of that business.
Yeah, and I remember everyone was, at first, people would give you a portal to get onto the internet, and they would charge you for it. And that kind of goes to this day. It's weird. I remember AOL, for a while, they still tried to maintain their ecosystem. People would have an AOL email, so they would want to control your email. And then you'd log on, you'd be in the AOL browser, and you could click on AOL related topics, news, and all that. And Microsoft did that with Netscape. And everyone tries to keep you in their, put you through their door. You control your experience on the web. And even today, it still happens.
Yes. I mean, it was a bunch of, I call them islands, right? Everybody had their island. AOL had its island. CompuServe had its island. They were all proprietary. You couldn't communicate from one service to another. And their goal was to build up, their own little island and, get as many inhabitants as they possibly could. So that was the world of online. So the internet via the vehicle of the web, because it was the web that made the internet popular. The web is what broke that logjam. And it's why, hey, you just pay a monthly fee and it's all you can eat. You want to be online 24 hours a day? No problem. You want to be accessing servers in Zimbabwe and Tierra del Fuego? No problem. That didn't exist until early 90s, mid 93, 94. And then it started started to really accelerate in 95. But you still didn't have a lot of human beings on the internet until, believe it or not, until the 2000s came along. And I've heard from people, and I think this is somewhat true, that you didn't really have the large percentage of the population comfortable with buying things on the internet until 2010. It took a while. I mean, I was selling things online from day one, but it was initially to a very small audience. I mean, there were only look, when I did my conference, that's one of the things that I cover in the book. I organized and sponsored the very first conference on web commerce ever on the planet Earth, right? And when we did that thing, which was November 5th, 1994 in San Francisco, there were only about 1 million people accessing the web. Total. Right now we've got, I think it's 5 billion. So it was a very small market.
So what broke open the web? It was just, I guess, the attractiveness and the availability of being able to go where you wanted was more than staying within AOL or staying within CompuServe or whoever's walled garden. Is that what happened to crack it open?
Yeah. So let me give you some perspective. So websites were so rare in 93 and even into 94 that there was an NCSA, that's out in the University of Illinois. They would have the website of the day. Like every day they'd announce the website of the day, and it was completely random. Like, okay, today's website of the day is about soccer. And then the next day, hey, there's a website, it's about elephants. Next, a website, oh, it's about traveling in Japan. Completely random, because websites were so freaking rare that it didn't matter what it was. People were just amazed, because you have to have lived through it, and you have to remember living through it. In the olden days, when you turned on your computer, you had access to only what was on your computer, period, end of story. So the thing that started to drive the web was content. People were putting up interesting stuff that people wanted. And there was this thing called surfing the web, which is a term that people still use. But now we kind of like, hey, I'm into jazz, so I'm going to surf jazz websites, or I'm into conspiracies, so I'm going to surf conspiracy websites, right? We're thematic, In those days, surfing just meant, oh, another website. This one's about rocks. Oh, this one's about, I don't know, farming, Oh, this one's about space travel. Like it didn't matter what it was about. We were so amazed that we could turn on our computer and see content that wasn't already on our computer. You follow?
Yeah, no, it's weird. Like I said, I remember thinking, what's the use of the computer? I feel stupid for thinking that, but I honestly didn't know what to do with it at first.
Yeah, well,
it just wasn't useful as now.
I mean, you'd type papers. In those days, you could type papers and make labels and, do spreadsheets. But it was actually quite limited. Right. So the web just blew it open, and it was the content. It was the content that, first somebody those guys in Switzerland, Tim Berners-Lee and Richard Caillou, they developed the web. They developed HTTP. They developed the idea of a browser. All the fundamentals of the web. They figured it all out, right? But they had no plan to make it available for the world. This was something they did while working for CERN, which is a scientific pan-European scientific organization dedicated to basically atomic research. And they just developed it because they were on payroll and they had the free time, and they wanted to make things easier to share other, high particle laboratories around the world. About, there's not that many of them, but in the old days when they wanted to share data with each other, it was a hassle. So these guys made this very simple text interface to make it easy. They called it the World Wide Web, and didn't catch on initially. It was just a few physicists, a few physics departments were using it around the world. And then the next important event was, like I mentioned before, these kids basically at University of Illinois, combination of undergrads and grad students, decided to put a graphical point and click interface on it. So now you didn't have to be a computer jockey to work it. And then we had this sort of rush of techies getting interested in the web, and then they added the image tag, which is what allows you to put pictures on the web, which, believe it or not, was highly controversial. Tim Berners-Lee, he said, I don't like this image tag. It's going to slow down performance on the web. It's going to really cause a problem. But obviously we have the image tag,
I think the first inkling of this being a web was where, I started seeing links in documents, and I remember you could click on it or hover over it and something would come up. And I thought that was really cool. And I remember going to yahoo.com, I think in 94 or 95, and it was just a page of like hundreds of links, business, finance, this, that, and the other. They'd have their logo, and you click a link, and then you could start going to, read stuff and see stuff. But it was all really text for a while. But links, again, for me, is what really started turning it into a web of information.
And links were baked into the cake from day one, right? Hyperlinks were HTTP, hypertext transfer protocol. That was baked into the cake from day one. And it's really interesting about Yahoo, right? I mean, Yahoo's kind of hit the skids, but there was a time there where they were the most powerful player on the entire internet. And they started, again, just to give you an idea how small the web was and how limited our scope was. Their idea was to manually create a directory of every single website by category. And they thought it was possible to do that. And I get it possible when they started. And once the growth curve started, it became impossible to keep up. The two guys doing it manually,
Yeah, so I guess the dot-com boom and crash probably helped, again, move the internet along, in fits and starts. Because I remember seeing commercials for like pets.com and Webvan and all this. And then it all died after the dot-com, collapse. But it seemed to put it into people's minds, I guess, at least for a time. But it still took time after that.
There were three essential things that had to happen. One, the guys in Switzerland had to create the basic protocol, right? If they didn't do that, and I want to get into this a little later, but let me give you a foreshadowing of it. If they hadn't done that, we would have no web today. We would have something very different and very inferior, and we'll get into what that would have been later. So they had to write that protocol and launch it, make it available, which they did in '89. The guys at University of Illinois had to have the inspiration to, at their own expense, on their own time, at their own sweat, create the graphical interface browser. That happened in '93. Two very important things happened in 1994, which we need to talk about. And then in 1995, you had the Netscape IPO, and that's when all the millions, really billions, actually it was trillion. Well, it wasn't a trillion in. It all got bid up on the stock market, but billions and billions, certainly hundreds of billions of dollars poured into the internet from basically August of 1995 after that IPO until the crash in 2001. And yeah, that period, even though it was filled with excesses and filled with insanity, was really important to building out the web to critical mass. And things slowed down quite a bit after the crash. And there were you can go back and read, many news articles, and people were predicting the internet was not going to survive. It was just a fad. It wasn't going to go anywhere. It was going to collapse. That's, by the way, when I started my systems seminar, 2002. And I mean, check this out. I was the only person teaching live seminars on internet marketing in 2002 on the planet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Crazy.
Right. That's where that was. Right. But let's go back to 1994, because two really important things happened in 1994 that were pivotal. It was kind of like the most important year. And by the way, there were a lot of things in addition to the web. There was a thing called Gopher. There was a thing called Waze. There was a thing called Anonymous FTP. There were all these attempts to make the internet a little bit more user friendly, and they failed, and the web could have failed. And we'll talk about that later, but let's talk about why it succeeded. So the reason the web succeeded, and I'm going to keep banging this point because it's so important. In 1993, nobody had ever heard of the World Wide Web, okay? In early 1993. What changed is 1994, two really important things. One, Jim Clark, who was the founder of Silicon Graphics. And if you don't know what Silicon Graphics is, they're out of business now. But when they were in business, they were the Rolls Royce of computers. And all those movies, Toy Story and the later Star Wars movies, all that special effects stuff that was in those movies that we have today, all came out of the Silicon Graphics graphical engine. Revolutionized graphics, took us from Stone Age to the Space Age. And the guy that founded that company was named Jim Clark. And just the same way that Steve Jobs was forced out of Apple, believe it or not, in 1985, Jim Clark found himself being... He wasn't forced out. He left because he was disgusted with the management. He left in 1994, January. And simultaneously with that, the guy that led the effort to create a graphical user interface for the web, Mark Andreessen, graduated from University of Illinois. So he's a graduate now. Like, he had a lot of fun in school. He built this browser. It was a cult classic. He had about 1 million people downloading it. Probably not 1 million. Probably some people were downloading it several times because they were having trouble, with it and downloading new versions. But we'll say 1 million for because it's an easy number. So he managed to get 1 million people using his software. But he didn't get a great job when he graduated. He got a kind of a mundane job in Silicon Valley, just like 1 million other kids with a computer engineering degree, and nothing much exciting was happening in his life. So, but by sort of miraculous timing, at the very same time that Jim Clark, who was this super powered entrepreneur, Silicon Valley entrepreneur guy, was looking for something to do, Mark Andreessen happened to arrive in Silicon Valley, and they met. Somebody introduced them, and they got talking, and Jim Clark said, "Hey, let's make a browser and server software company." And they did. And so in April of 1994, they started what was originally called, their first name was Electronic Communications, or some crazy name, which they had to change because of a copyright matter. And then they, trademark matter, and then they changed it to Mosaic. And then later, because of another trademark matter, they had to change it to Netscape. But in any event, they were the first company to make and sell, in a serious way, any kind of internet-related software. And what they sold were the browser and the server. And the server is the machine that has all the pages on it, and that's what you browse. You browse the server with your browser. You access the server with your browser. So these kinds of software programs had existed. Mosaic, of course, which was created at University of Illinois. But there was another one. There was the Cello. There was, there was a bunch of them. But they didn't have any high-octane business power behind them. They were just sort of like freeware, and they were being run by engineers, and it was a slow boat to China, and nothing was really happening. So the biggest event was when Jim Clark, kind of a Silicon Valley Superman, linked up with Mark Andreessen, a very ambitious, very intelligent, very driven college graduate. They got all the kids who had worked on the browser, because you had a browser for Unix, you had a browser for Windows, you had a browser for Mac, and so there was a team of about 7 guys. And Clark went over to the University of Illinois and swooped them all up, brought them back to Silicon Valley, and started selling browsers and servers for real. So that was really important. And guys, if that hadn't happened, no web. We would not have a web today. Okay, and I'll explain why in a bit. So
Didn't say what would have happened, but you'll get to that. But
I'll get there. When we get there, it's going to be horrifying. Okay, so the next important thing that happened, and this was my contribution. I was a direct marketing person, direct mail, direct response person before the web came along, and as soon as I saw the web, I'm like, this is the perfect direct marketing medium of all time. Now, interestingly enough, I couldn't persuade any of the internet people of that, and I talk about that in the book. And I couldn't persuade any of the direct marketing people of that, and in 94 I couldn't, and I talk about that in the book. But I didn't care whether they were persuaded or not, because I knew it was true, and it was inevitable. It was going to happen. So what I was doing was organizing, various meetings and brainstorming sessions and so on, because there was no vision as to how the web was going to pay for itself. Okay, it's like, okay, it's cool, but who's going to pay the server bill? And who's going to pay the person to make the pages? And, who's going to pay for the bandwidth? And there was no answer to that. I mean, it's hard to believe. Now, interestingly enough, in the history of the radio, there was a magazine, I think it's called Radio Journal. Anyway, they had a cover story where they asked the same question. Who is to pay for broadcasting and how? And they offered, I think it was a $500 prize, which now would be the equivalent of like $12,000. And they were soliciting the world, saying, okay, we got this great thing. We've got antennas. We've got radios. We can broadcast. How are we going to pay for it? How are we going to make this a business? Because nobody knew. And nobody in early 1994, nobody knew. And I document that 100% in this book. And nobody can prove any different. Now, some companies like, Amazon had the idea of selling stuff. Okay, fine. But that wasn't going to create critical mass on the web, because it wasn't easy to sell stuff on the web. Anyway, selling stuff.
I think it might have been the needs that connect. Like, again, bulletin boards were first. And I remember like Internet Relay Chat, IRC. And then there's versions of chat, but it was again about connecting with people, and the modern day manifestation now is social media and stuff like that, and just that undercurrent's what pushed it too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But what made it financially viable was advertising. Right? In other words, we'll put ads on the website. There were no ads on websites in 1994.
Like it's people hate ads, but they're necessary, especially in cases like
Well,
this.
you can hate them all you want, and people do, but there's no such thing as radio without ads. There's no such thing as television without ads, and there's no such thing as the web without ads. Now, there was a very strong deeply rooted cultural opposition to advertising on the internet, especially among the first generation of internet users. They really thought it was a sacrilege. And I'm like, well, you can think that. But this thing ain't going nowhere unless it can pay for itself. And the only way it can pay for itself is advertising, like it or not. I mean, I would love it if everybody would work for free for me and just, do whatever I bid them to do without me having to pay them. But that's not how the world works.
Yeah, that's a really interesting statement, People complain about it. And I remember they showed some city with no advertisements that you could see. And people think it's a great thing. But you're right. A lot of what we enjoy in life, it just wouldn't happen without advertising around it and behind it and, involved in it at all.
Yeah, I mean, all right, a lot of it's crap, yeah, but what is the alternative? So one of the meetings I put on was June 11th, 1994, and I had Mark Graham, who at the time was called Mr. Internet. That's how small the commercial internet was. In the entire computer industry, he was known as Mr. Internet. He was voted one of the 100 most important people in computing because of his efforts to champion the commercialization of the internet. So that was Mark Graham. I had Mark Fleischman, who was, believe it or not, the first guy to put up a shingle and be a independent web presence developer full time. There had to be a first guy. It was Mark Fleischman. And he was doing really amazing stuff even back in 93. I mean, he was super genius guy, but he was the first. And then the third guy I had for this particular meeting on June 11th, 1994 was Rick Boyce. And Rick Boyce was a media buyer for Hal Riney and Partners, which is a big advertising agency, or a very, very highly regarded advertising agency. Media buyer is the guy that, somebody develops all the creative stuff, the dancing bear or whatever. And then Rick is the guy that goes, okay, we got to buy some spaces on NBC and CBS and radio. We got to buy some newspaper ads and magazine ads. That's the media buyer. So he was a very, very, very intelligent, far-sighted guy. And I actually met him at a conference where he was talking about, hey guys, what are we going to do when we have 500 TV channels? Because in those days, that was not an issue. You had, cable kind of boosted your number of choices from 5, which was broadcast, to maybe 50 total. Not like today where you have so many channels you can't even count them. So he was asking, gee, what are we going to do when we have 500 channels? Because as a media buyer, I can barely deal with the buying that I'm doing now, right? So after he spoke, I said, Rick, I think it's going to be worse than 500. I think it's going to be 5 million. Have you ever heard of the World Wide Web? And this was early 94, and he said, I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it. So I started to tutor him in it. And then I visited him one day at his office at Hal Riney, and I said, we got to figure out how advertising agencies like yours can buy ads on web pages, because if that doesn't start happening, how are people going to maintain these websites and put new material on and maintain the material that's on there? So he went to the Standard Rate and Data Service, SRDS, which is a multi-volume industry publication. So one is for TV. It has all the TV stations, what's available, what the ads cost, all the radio stations, a volume, and you have a volume on magazines and a volume on newspapers and a volume on mailing lists, which you probably heard of because of Gary Halbert used to talk about the SRDS, right? So then there was one that I'd never heard of called the Miscellaneous. And these were all the places you could buy ads that weren't radio, weren't television, weren't catalog, weren't direct mail. And he said, I guess it would go in here. So that may not seem like a very significant thing to you, but to me, that was mind-boggling, because it was like, okay, we now have a place to put internet ads. And again, there were no internet ads in 1994. They did not exist, okay, in early 1994 when I was doing this work, right? So I thought, okay, at least we have a place. Once we've got them to sell, we can put them in the miscellaneous Standard Rate and Data Service book. I was over the moon. I'd finally, because I'd talked to thousands of people in 93 and 94. And the number of people that were interested was 1 out of 1,000. And the number of those the number of the people who were interested, who had anything to contribute, was 1 out of 1,000 of that 1,000. I mean, it was a rare person that was A, interested, and B, could bring anything to the party. And Rick brought something to the party, you know? So we had our meeting with Rick and Mark, the two Marks, Mark Fleischman and Mark Graham, and we talked about all these different things. And the goal was how is this thing going to be commercialized? Enough already, enough of the talk, enough of the pie in the sky. How are we going to make this thing pay so that it can grow and become a true global network? And we spent all day together. We had a little audience listening to our panel discussions. And we got to the end of the day. Everybody was happy, but I wasn't because we hadn't answered the question. So something popped into my mind at the last minute after the meeting was over. And I said to Mark, Graham, hey, could you come over here? I want to just make sure what I'm saying here is accurate. So I sat down with Mark and Rick Boyce, and I said, Rick, here's how it works. You have a screen, a web page. You can put a little square on the web page. People can click on it, and it will take them to a bigger page. And not only that, but you can calculate how many people saw the ad and how many people clicked on the ad. So you know how effective your ads are. That was June 11th, 1994. And that was the birth of the banner ad. And everything that makes the internet commercially viable, other than selling directly, but even those people need to buy banner ads. And by the way, Amazon sells hundreds of billions. I think they sell over $100 billion worth of banner ads a year. It's some crazy number. That was the birth of the banner ad. Now, and I had to have, now my knowledge of the tech was so weak that I had to have Mark Graham there to say, Rick and Mark, is this, could you actually, I mean, am I right? Can you actually like track how many people see the ad versus how many people click on? And he said, sure, that's really easy. I mean, it's not easy, but it was doable. By the way, now it's all done with web analytics. All the way through to 1996, it was done manually. You'd go to your web logs and you'd look at the freaking log and you'd see how many pages was this click, Glenn? Laid it out. All right. Hey, Amazon, who was it? Yahoo didn't even start using banner ads. So we did this in June 11 of 1994. Yahoo didn't even put web ads, banners on its website until 1996. And it was still so primitive. Not only did they have, eyeball analytics, they had to hand put every banner on every page. They didn't have a banner ad serving system as late as 1996. So you might say, well, Ken, it's, you had this talk with this guy and, how can you say that that's when the banner ad was born? Here's how I can tell you that, guys, because Rick quit his job eventually at the ad agency and went to work for a brand new company called Hotwired.com. Now, Hotwire, oh gosh, I should know that. I wrote the book. But anyway, Hotwire, it was called Hotwire. Hotwire was a division of Wired magazine. Hotwire.com was the very first website that sold banner ads. And not only that, but attempted to exist by selling advertising. That had never happened before in the history of the internet. You never had a bunch of adults get together and say, we're going to have a business with an office and desks and chairs, and we're going to pay everybody a salary, and we're going to put up content, and we're going to sell ads, and the ads are going to pay our way. That Hotwire was the very first company to ever do that in the history of mankind, right? Who sold the ads? Rick Boyce, the guy that was at my conference, who I cultivated and worked with for months, teaching him the web, and then coming up with the idea of you put a little square on the page and you click on it and you can calculate the click-through rate.
Yeah. This one guy sold real estate on his website. Like each pixel was, $1 or something, and he made $1 million selling each pixel of a website. I remember all these weird little things from decades ago. I don't know what happened to them, but you're bringing up all these memories.
There were a lot of crazy ideas floating around back then, but the one that stuck was click on this little square and calculate the click-through rate. That's the basis of Google, Facebook, and millions of other websites. Now, would somebody have come up with this? Yes, probably. But here's the problem. All this stuff was not happening in a vacuum. You had a company called Microsoft that existed back then. It still exists today. And again, you had to live through that era, or if you're a student, you can do the scholarship and confirm that it's true. Microsoft absolutely controlled the personal computer in a way that nobody can even fathom to this day. So remember, computers were not connected to the internet. The only thing that you had on your computer screen, what was in your hard drive, period, right? And the operating system was a Microsoft operating system. In 92 to 95% of the cases. By the way, Apple almost went out of business in the early 1990s. Look it up. They almost went bankrupt. They were circling the drain. In fact, strangely enough, Bill Gates saved them. But that's a whole nother story. But you have to understand the personal computer, there were no phones, obviously. There were no tablets. There was none of this stuff. Everything was desktop, right? And Microsoft completely controlled it, all right? And before Wired came along with its sort of lifestyle version of Computer World, every computer magazine was a trade magazine, reviews on hardware, reviews on software. And guess who the 900,000 ton gorilla was in all those magazines, because they bought the preponderance of the ads? Microsoft, okay? So the control, and if you dare to write something negative about Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, then you can look him up if you don't recognize that name, Steve Ballmer would call you up personally and chew your ass out. And believe me, the publishers and the editors learned very carefully that you did not say bad things about Microsoft and its garbage products in the pages of any personal computer magazine, because you would be in financial trouble fast. The other thing that Microsoft liked to do was, if you developed something unique, interesting, useful, valuable for personal computing, and it threatened their dominance of the desktop, which included the operating system and Word and some of their products, they would let you grow, and then they would make you an offer you couldn't refuse. And I talked with a top guy in Silicon Valley PR, public relations. And he said, well, my job is simple. I basically help companies get to critical mass so they can either be purchased or destroyed by Microsoft. So they would offer a price, and if you said yes, they would buy it, and they would either integrate your new gizmo into their world, or they would shelve it, and the world would never see it again. And a lot of people were okay with that, because, hey, I just got a $20 million paycheck, or whatever. So there was a group of entrepreneurs that weren't happy necessarily about that, but it's like, hey, I can buy an island, or I can buy a yacht or something. Now, if you didn't say yes, what they would do is they would do a knockoff of your product really quick, something crappy, and they would sell it for 1/10 the price to their vast installed base, which was basically the entire personal computer world. So here you are creating something of value, great quality, the world could really use, make the world a better place, costs you money to do that, and here they are killing you, strangling you in the cradle by undercutting you. This is, by the way, what Amazon does to so many online merchants. That's another issue. I talk about it in the book a little bit. But that's how the computer world operated pre-internet. Gates ruled everything, and he was despised. He was absolutely despised in Silicon Valley.
I wonder what's well.
Yeah, see, we get.
I mean, the people that despise him, it's just it's grown and changed. But yeah, I don't think he was ever.
No, and there was a joke, and I have it in the book. How many Microsoft engineers does it take to change a light bulb?
Okay,
None. They declared darkness the standard.
Yeah.
And that is the best summary of the impact that Microsoft had pre-internet. Steve Jobs talked about this. You can find videos of him talking about this in detail. He basically strangled all the innovation and creativity and usefulness out of the personal computer. Now, he was trying to improve his disaster of a Windows operating system. And their original goal was to put it out in 93. And they were also developing their Microsoft network, which was going to be, they envisioned it to compete with Prodigy and CompuServe. AOL didn't even rate back then. It was still too small to care about. So their idea was, hey, we'll create our own Microsoft network. We will make it available seamlessly to everybody via our control of the desktop, and we will be the online world. And we will strangle CompuServe the way we strangle everybody, and Prodigy and Genie and all those other, lightweights financially, comparatively. And we will be the people providing the world with the BBS, the online experience. And remember, the BBS experience, as fun as it was you're only accessing the computer that's owned by the guy you're accessing. He controls all the content. All right. So you don't go CompuServe and say, hey, I want to open up a store. Or, hey, I want to have a podcast. Or, hey, any one of the billion things that people do on the internet and can do without even thinking twice about. You didn't do that with Prodigy or AOL or CompuServe. That was their territory. Now, if you were a huge corporation, they might say, yeah, give us $500,000 and we'll integrate you into our thing and we'll charge you, $100,000 a month and, you'll deal with our people and blah, blah, blah. In fact, I knew a guy that did that for corporations. He had to do his separate deal with CompuServe, a separate deal with Prodigy. For big corporations, he would create these alliances. But there was no such thing as a little guy throwing up a website and doing a blog or doing a podcast or having a YouTube channel. That did not exist on BBSs, okay? Now, here's the very real scenario of what could have happened. Had Microsoft gotten its shit together and gotten their steaming pile of garbage known as Windows working in 93, remember, they didn't have their big launch until 95. And by the way, they had to spend $300 million promoting, which that was a lot of money in 1995. They spent $300 million promoting Windows 1995. Had they gotten that together in 93, and had they gotten Microsoft Network together in 93, they would have obliterated CompuServe, Prodigy, Genie, and they probably would have strangled AOL in the cradle because AOL did not break out until 94, right? So if they had gotten all that together in 1993, there would have been no World Wide Web. Okay, because people would have said, what the hell do I want to, because you had to work hard in 1994. You had to download the browser. You had to configure the browser would crash 100 times. I mean, it wasn't all, strawberries and cream in the early days. So if they had been able to offer an online service directly off the desktop, right on the homepage of your logon page on Microsoft Windows. And if they had made it even halfway decent, they could have eliminated all these other online services and nobody would have known about or heard about or cared about the web because they would never know about it.
It's so funny. Even today, like throughout the decades, I have a lot of friends that have worked for Microsoft and I've just watched them make stuff and then nothing, like they're kind of like Motorola. I remember I worked with Motorola for a little while. So like Microsoft had the Windows phone. They spent all this money and then it went nowhere. And then they had the Zune, versus the iPod or whatever, and it went nowhere. And then they had the this and they had the that. It's like, it's amazing that they've made all these things and each thing fails. And it's always after other people create it. I wonder how they're still in business, but the only way they still are in business, it seems, is they make all this money from Office and from these legacy control mechanisms they had over, again, Windows and browsers. And the only way they seem to make money is through locking people into their stuff. They don't make it by making good stuff.
Exactly. And because it is a, Bill Gates production and Steve Ballmer production. They liked it that way. They liked the idea of we're going to control, and they did. They controlled the desktop until the web broke out. They controlled it. There was no other, you could go to AOL, you could go to CompuServe. Not many people did, by the way, but you could. But other than that, you were locked into Microsoft. There were only a few people using Apple. It wasn't a big company in the 90s. It was failing. It was going down. It wasn't going up. It was failing. So
what would the web experience be like today? If, in an alternate universe of evil, wow.
Be like, yeah, you have to understand, there were a lot of things. There was a thing called Gopher. There was a thing called Waze. There was a thing called Anonymous FTP. There was IRC, as you pointed out earlier, Internet Relay Chat. There were all these kind of geeky, kind of clunky, but good enough things, but not good enough for prime time, but good enough for nerds. They never went anywhere. The web could have been something that never went anywhere. Remember that if they had, keep the chronology in mind, everybody. The guys in the University of Illinois did not start on their graphical interface browser until 1993. It didn't get traction among nerds until late 1993. It didn't start to get public attention until the IPO in 1995. All right. There were people talking about it. There were a few people on it, but believe me, it was like 1% of the country was dealing with the web as late as early 1995. If Microsoft had gotten their Windows system together and not wasted all that time and money from 93 to 95 trying to make it work. If they'd gotten it together in 93, if they'd gotten Microsoft Network together in 1993, if they'd put a join Microsoft Network button on everybody's desktop, they would have killed CompuServe, AOL, Prodigy, and Genie, and the web never would have happened. I know this is really hard. It's like, let's try something comparable. World War II.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like the Nazis getting the atomic bomb before we did.
Except,
Scale.
and that was a matter of timing because they were well along the way. Thanks, by the way, to Klaus Schwab's father, Klaus Schwab's father, who sold them high precision piping for their nuclear weapons program. But that's another story. What if the Germans had developed the atom bomb first? What if instead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was Liverpool and Manchester or Liverpool and Birmingham, big manufacturing centers in England? I know that, Churchill had a stiff upper lip, but I think getting whacked twice by atom bombs on two of the country's most important cities, I think would have changed things dramatically, right? So people may say, well, I can't even imagine a world where the Germans owned Europe. Well, it was just a matter of who got there first with the atomic bomb. And that is the same thing with the online world, except it's even more amazing because with the atom bomb, you had the whole United States, right, pouring billions of dollars into it, throwing everything they had at it versus, the German scientific, infrastructure. With the Microsoft Web, it was like a group of tribesmen with sharpened spears going up against the Pentagon. Because that's the Pentagon being Microsoft and the tribal people with sharpened spears being us. We had nothing. We had nothing. We had no media traction. We had no money. We had no, nothing. We just had an idea.
The important idea out of this whole interview and out of your book, it may sound like hyperbole, but I'm literally feeling it in my body as we're talking about it. This is in a different way, and some people may say it's ridiculous, but this is as important as Germany not having the atomic bomb, I believe. Personally, this win to the internet, it's that important. It just hit me as we're talking about it.
So that's why the subhead of the book is the inside story of how a motley crew, I just sort of like this. It's a rock band, but it means pirates, basically, of outsiders, and we were outsiders, hijacked the information superhighway. Because that's the other thing. Gates was working with McCaw, is that guy, Cellular, and who's a multi-gazillion billionaire fellow, and they wanted to create sort of an in-house information superhighway that Microsoft would do the software and the cellular company would provide the wiring, and it was going to be in your living room, and it was going to be controlled by oligarchs, by like two guys. We're going to control the whole thing. I don't know if it's probably billions of dollars was being spent on that. That was when people used the term information superhighway in the early 90s, that's what they were envisioning. They were envisioning this sort of interactive television set that was controlled by Bill Gates and some telecom people, right? So that concept of the information superhighway existed, and this group of outsiders hijacked it using the web to give a democratic platform. See, guys, you got to realize there would be no Amazon. I don't love Amazon, but we use it, right? There would be no buying stuff online unless you went through Microsoft Network. There would be no Richard Jacobs with a podcast. That would never happen, dude.
Well, it would be allowed, by the way.
What's that?
That would be especially allowed. I'm just kidding.
No, yeah. But you know what I mean? Like, or there'd be no me. Anything that you do online, there'd be no Google. And I don't love Google, but I'm glad they exist. There'd be no YouTube. Not all, you got to take the whole thing down. And because from Gates's point of view, hey, I own the desktop. I own the network. If you want to put content on there, you got to run it through my guys. And you want to have a store? Oh, good luck. Good luck. You're going to have to pay us to get in. You're going to have to pay us a share of everything. There'd be no Amazon. There wouldn't be some, a handful of guys. And they actually legitimately started out as a handful of clueless guys. By the way, they were so clueless that they were packing their boxes sitting on the floor. Someone had to tell them, why didn't you get a packing table and put the boxes and the books on tables? They didn't even know that. That's how green they were, right? So all of these million plus little enterprises that make our lives so nice online would not exist. And instead, we'd probably still be paying by the hour for access, and we'd be accessing one computer system, whatever Bill Gates and Microsoft deemed fit for the world to have. Now, people wonder why I poured 4 years of my life into fighting Bill Gates and his COVID scam, because that thing cost me about $1 million. All that effort, easy. Well, if I was making money, if I put the same effort that I did into writing all those books and doing all that stuff with Bobby Kennedy and all at my own expense, by the way, I think I could have made $1 million in 4 years.
Yeah, true.
I know I can because
a thing or two. That's true.
Yeah, I know a thing or two. I'm gonna say it conservatively cost me $1 million. I don't care. I have the money. One of the reasons I was so offended by the whole thing, it was Bill Gates rearing his ugly head again, using his monopoly, his bullying monopoly bribery system to create a shitty version of the world, which is what he did during the personal computer era. And he succeeded, sadly, in doing the same thing for a limited amount of time, but enough time to create a lot of misery for many hundreds of millions of people. He did the same damn thing with, quote, public health. So I was in a battle. I wasn't just, it was personal to me. It wasn't just, I think this is wrong and I want to do something about it. It's like, no way is this guy going to get away with this. No way. Now, he got away with it for a couple of years. But
what comes to mind is like, there can be no human flourishing. And this is me saying this. If despots or, dictators or whatever you want to call them, or these megalomaniacs are in charge of things, there just can be no human flourishing.
Exactly.
Like you talked about with the web.
And the flourishing, is messy. You're going to have some crappy websites. You're going to have people doing some shady things. I mean, it's just going to be the way it is. And I hope I convey this in the book. The flowering of human creativity that's occurred because of the existence of the web. See, the news media will never tell you that. They'll tell you how it's this dark, dangerous place. And it's, there's all kinds of bad things, misinformation, disinformation, right? They'll never say, this is the most amazing thing that's happened to humanity since the printing press. And in fact, it's like exponentially beyond the printing press. I mean, any subject that anybody wants to learn, you can find it on the internet. You may have to dig and you may have to, have some judgment, and you might get burned occasionally. But basically, any topic that you can imagine, you can find absolutely high quality information about for free, And if you need to pay a little bit, you pay a little bit. This did not exist. And remember, guys, you have to be old enough to remember this. When I wanted to know something, I had to get on my bicycle and go to the library.
Yep,
and
me too.
And I loved my library. I still love my library. But the library only has the books the library has, right? So I would reach the end of knowledge pretty quickly, right?
Well, along those lines, I was going to say, I remember going to the bookstore my whole life, and there would be like one little shelf of computer books, and then a whole stand of computer books, and then multiple shelves. And then until bookstores really kind of fell out, fortunately, there was now a whole section of like 30 shelves of computer books. Like, if you just look at that, you see how things have grown over time.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think the thing to remember is, as beautiful as bookstores are and as libraries are, they're islands, they're contained units. And what the web's done is it's like, hey, if it's out there, wherever it is, if it's online, you can get it. If you're living in the most obscure place in the world, but you have a web connection, you can reach it. If you're dead broke but can make it to a library where they have public internet terminals, you can get it. This is amazing. And you'll never hear big media or big government or any other fascistic organizations sing the praises of this reality because it undermines them.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
Because they love to say, and I talk about it in the book, they love to certify. Well, this is certified news. Why? Because it came from CNN, those liars, right? Or this is certified information. Why? Because it came from Harvard University. Well, you know what? A guy in his basement might come up with something better than Harvard University. It happens all the time. So to your point, if we don't have a vehicle like the web, like we have, we're very subject. I mean, all the things that we know, take everything you've ever learned or heard about on the internet and erase it and make yourself dependent on NBC, CBS, NBC, ABC, and Fox, the New York Times and Washington Post. How would you like to live in a world where that is your sole source of information? And maybe if you can make it to the library or make it to the bookstore, you might be able to make a little penetration of greater understanding. And that was your whole world. That was the world before the web.
Also, I would be interested in a topic like, I had hamsters when I was a teenager, and I would go to, every time we were wherever, I would look for a bookstore and I'd go in there and look for books about it. And I slowly built up maybe 15, 20 books about it, but that was it. Or if you wanted to track someone down and ask them something, you would try to find their phone number if you knew their name in the phone book. But otherwise, you couldn't get a lot of information unless you physically went to get it.
Yeah. I mean, it was a quaint and wonderful time because there's a funny story about the Beatles, and they were self-taught, and they never really learned music theory properly, but they knew the names of chords and stuff. And they all once got on a bus together as kids and crossed Liverpool to go to somebody's house because he knew a chord that they didn't know.
Really?
That's a true story out of the mouths of Paul McCartney himself. So that, it was kind of nice. It was kind of a nice thing. But we live in a world now where the elites, the oligarchs, whatever you want to call them, are so bloodthirsty and so ruthless that if we don't have alternative channels of communication, we're going to be toast. So thanks to the web, we have those alternative channels of communication. We can educate ourselves in all kinds of things, and we can learn alternative visions of the news. We don't have to depend on what we're hearing on the idiot box. So the web is a big deal. And the point I want to make in the book, I tell the story of exactly how it came to be, all the little twists and turns. And as I was telling the story, it suddenly dawned on me, wow, this was a chain of events. And the book identifies the chain. This had to happen, and this had to happen, and this had to happen. The chain could have broken easily at any one point. Like CERN could have said, the guys that invented the fundamental protocol of the web, this is proprietary and you may not use it. This is just for our use. End of story. Game over. Mark Andreessen and Jim Clark might never have met. And so you'd have some frustrated middle-aged guy right now, Mark Andreessen, working at some shitty job instead of being a billionaire VC as he is now. And that if they hadn't met and hadn't started Mosaic, which became Netscape, game over. And I'm also going to say, if we hadn't figured out, put a little square on a web page, click on it, calculate the click-through rate, sell the ads, and then Rick actually did something with it with Hotwire. And by the way, that showed the way. People saw that. That was like a massive news story when that happened. And a million commercial websites came into being like overnight. Everybody got it. They were all putting up websites, creating content, selling ads. It was like, we got the model. We're ready to go, right? If that hadn't happened, well, same thing. Link of the chain of events broken. And then on the parallel, had Microsoft gotten itself together just 2 years earlier, gotten the Windows together, their improved Windows version, gotten their Microsoft network together, slapped a join the Microsoft network button on the startup screen to every personal computer on the planet, I don't think the web would have happened.
That's amazing. This has been a great call. I feel so galvanized and excited by it. I encourage listeners.
We should. The people created something amazing. Didn't come from the top down. It came from us.
I've heard some of the same about crypto, but that's actively, it's trying to be co-opted in the same way. But yeah, I've heard similar from people in the crypto space. So,
but remember, the whole crypto thing runs on top of the web, so there'd be no web, no crypto.
Real. Well, very good, Ken. So the book is How the Web Won. It's on Amazon. Fantastic book. If anything you've heard in this interview piques your curiosity, you definitely want to read it. And frankly, again, this is not hyperbole either, but Ken being one of the the forefathers of all this and one of the originators of a lot of this stuff, it's like reading about one of your heroes if you're in internet marketing, because there's Ken's past and his history in the two interwoven. So I highly recommend it for anyone listening, and I mean that 100%. And Ken, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been great.
Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.